All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Zach Martin. I'm a senior policy advisor here at Venable. I work with the Cybersecurity Coalition in the center across a variety of different matters and clients. I'm happy to be here to talk about the Common Vulnerability and Exposure Program. Is this on? Can you guys hear me? Is this on? Okay. So for 25 years, the Common Vulnerability and Exposure Program has been a cornerstone of vulnerability management worldwide. Back in April, that cornerstone was shaken um, when the CVE board, with a day's notice, was notified that the government contract was going to expire. At the 11th hour, the CVE program was saved for another year, but this has caused the industry to ponder a world without the CVE program or potentially a different model for tracking and reporting vulnerabilities. And that's what we're going to discuss today during this panel. What's the future going to look like for the reporting of CVEs and how this might change in the next few months or years? So to start, I'm going to have each of my panelists introduce themselves and ask, and talk about, what went through your heads last April when you first heard that the CVE program was going to be defunded. Now, what was your initial reaction? What did you think last April when that news came across your desks?
There we go. I'm Mitch Herkus. I'm Global Head of Government Affairs for Wiz. I've been working in and around government for a couple decades now. When it comes to the CVE program and when that news kind of flashed that they were trying to figure out who was on first and how it was going to continue, I, you know, I have I am at a company that is about 5 years old. Let's start there. So, um, I have never gotten so many Slack messages in so short a period of time, as I was, maybe a year into standing up a government affairs shop within a organization that does cybersecurity. So all sorts of parts of the organization reached out, with a "What does this all mean?" and fix it, fix it now." So, I think it kind of speaks to the operational saliency of the program and how valuable it is and how much it underpins what we do, despite, some of the operational issues that I'm sure we'll get into today and some of the governance things.
It's my mic.
You all want
Okay, does this work now? Hi, my name is Pete Aller. I'm with the CVE Foundation, and I am also a current CVE board member underneath the CVE program sponsored by CISA. I no longer work for an employer, so I don't have to worry about that. As a CVE board member, we found out via an email that there was a problem. My thought was, what in the world happened? We didn't even see it coming, and we had met the week prior in person, face to face, as part of the VON conference that we co-sponsor with First.org. Why? Why is this a problem? And why didn't we know? Good question. It's a governance problem. But I think there's too much focus on that problem. And the example I use is that was a volcano. You missed the earthquake. The earthquake was rumbling for a long period of time, and it started at VonCon of 2024, almost a year prior. And where CISA basically said to all the incident response teams that were in attendance for about 350 people in person was that we didn't do a good job at SDLC and we didn't know how to do coordination. Not exactly what you wanted to talk about because there was no discussion. It was a declaration. So realize that the CVE Foundation started prior to that. As board members, we realized we had a problem while we tried to work through a system that, quite honestly, is missing some rules. So my challenge was, how do I tell my friends who are all pounding me, same with Slack and Keybase and Signal and text messaging and all that, when it blew up, everything was fine. And to be honest with you, the system we set up for submitting for and gaining the CVE was never at risk. It could run for several months without that, and it's open source code because we had donated it. So now the question comes back to what is the structure and what is it that we're doing for governance? And I'll leave it at that for now.
So I'm Nick Gleiserson. I work at the Institute for Security and Technology, and I thought, here we go again. Because when I was at the White House in 2024, we had seen funding challenges with the National Vulnerability Database, which is a separate program from the CVE program, but they both look at vulnerabilities. And to have another, funding crisis of sorts within 14 months, it was, oh boy, I hope policymakers pay attention. And that's because for me personally, right, the first time that I really looked at the CVE program as a policymaker was in 2016 when there was a separate set of crises. And it became, I was telling Pete earlier, it became a like, oh, always on the priority list. Really, we should look at this from either the congressional perspective, the White House perspective, because it is so important, as evidenced by all of the phone calls, Slacks, emails, everything else that people had around the same time. But hasn't really gotten a lot of attention from policymakers. And as a policymaker myself, it was always like, yep, gonna get to that. That's in my 3-month window. Like, definitely we're going to look and see if there are things that could be changed from a governance standpoint to make the program more effective. And for 8 years, that's where it stayed in the like, yep, just going to get to that as soon as the crisis du jour has disappeared. And so it was heartening for me to see following April, both the uproar from industry, and that really is what it was, international partners as well, that something needs to be done here, and the fact that we then did see members of Congress start to say, "Hey, let's have an audit of these two programs, CVE and the NVD, the National Vulnerability Database." And it's really started, I think, in earnest. The foundation was announced, right? It started in earnest some critical conversations about the future of the program. But again, day of, all I was thinking was, "Here we go again."
So we touched on some of the topics that we're going to definitely be delving into a little bit more, but one of the things, and it was brought up briefly, is that the CVE program as it exists now is too U.S. centric. How do we expand? How do we expand that scope? How do we bring in other stakeholders? How do we expand the geography of it?
First of all, they have to be at the table. The real question is, what is the table? Because you can't have 190 some governments trying to do the same thing. So we need a representation way, and it has to be a rotational basis. In that, you also allow for vuln scanners, you allow for producers, open and closed source, and you need the user group, the consumers, and they need to be represented by sector and by region. So you have to have a lot of build up and how you bring things forward. But the biggest thing we're missing is the requirements. And then the dedicated staff to do those technological and infrastructure things to quickly, and I mean within months, accomplish those requirements because the game is on already and we're behind.
So I would back up a little bit. So, we do have, look, there's the CVE program, and that's grown up effectively organically in many ways, right? It started, I think, and this is probably getting out of my zone with other people who are better at, basically a list on the internet at one point, and it's grown into something much more mature over time. But I don't think there's been a stop to rethink, like, what is the law, if we were going to rebuild, what does this look like? I think we're at a point now where there's the EUVD, there's other international bodies that are built their own versions of a vulnerability database. This kind of came up during the Luminary panel. I think recognizing that, is the first question is the CVE a US based effort, or is it an international effort? If it's a US based effort, we want to bring in our international partners, obviously, to inform that and work on that. But there is an operational piece there, and bring in those private sector entities to Peter's part, bring in international entities to inform and align, I think is critical. And there can be organizational structures to do that. But we also have to recognize it's no longer the only game in town either. There's these other entities internationally that are also working on it. So I think that has to be part of the discussion as well.
So what I would say is, right, if you zoom out and look at why is CVE so important? Like what is the biggest source of value that the program provides? And it is the ability to identify globally what the heck we're talking about when we're talking about a vulnerability. And if you go back and read the 1999 paper from a couple of folks at MITRE who outline what the world looked like before CVE, and this is really actually close to Ari's talk about what the world looked like before CISA. So what the world looked like before CVE was these were the CISO team, right? The operational defenders at MITRE. They would get alerts from vendors, and then they would have to manually, using their own wisdom, try and figure out, are these all referring to the same thing? Because I've got six different alerts. They all seem to eventually tie down to the same library, but it's not really clear. And it's not clear if the mitigations I'm taking for the first alert will apply to any of the others. That was life before the CVE program. And today we do have a record, an identifier that can be used even in other databases that build on it. And, there are two things that I think are important to think about in terms of what value this brings. One is compare it to an area in cybersecurity where we don't have those sorts of universal identifiers. And someone raised this with me earlier this week, threat actors, right? It's like threat actors, think about the amount of Sturm and Drang there is about trying to figure out, is Storm 0558, is that a typhoon? Is that a blizzard? Is it a panda? Where does this all land? Right? We do not have any sort of canonical identifiers for them. Now, there are some reasons that that's a more challenging problem than it is with software defects. But just to be clear, like CVE allows us to cut right to, okay, we're all talking about the same thing. The other thing that I'll say is even the EUVD, the European Union Vulnerability Database that was stood up in May, it uses CVE IDs as the index. And in fact, the EUVD says by policy, if you are adding things to the EUVD that fall within the CVE program scope, you got to go get a CVE ID. So that's good. That's really good. That's the global good that we're talking about, that people can, across the entire internet, know what the heck they're talking about when they're talking about a vulnerability. The concern is there's been a single source of funding for 26 years. That's the US government. And this critical cybersecurity infrastructure, in the words of my colleague Josh, right, is critical not just to the US, it's critical to companies, industry, and to governments around the world. So to keep it on a sustainable path and not to take steps back, a la what we may be doing right now with CISA 2015, the Cybersecurity and Information Sharing Act 2015. I'm looking at you, Ari. In contrast with that, to avoid taking those steps back, we need to have a more inclusive governance structure that recognizes that this is international cybersecurity critical infrastructure.
So earlier this summer, the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law released a paper on the CVE program, kind of raised some questions about what the future of the program might be. Earlier today, IST released a paper on the CVE paper as well. Nick, do you care to kind of give us a little bit of summary of that paper and kind of what you all covered in that? And I know that Pete and Mitch were able to take a look at that previous, so let's talk about that paper a little bit.
Yeah, I happy to. So myself and my co-authors, Bob Lord and Lauren Zabrick, have a paper that was released in 30 minutes that sort of talks about this issue. And I think foundationally, what we're trying to add, and it's very much building on Ari's paper from the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law, is that there are real challenges here, and from policymaking standpoint, there are just a couple of points that are really important to get clear. The first is identification and cataloging of vulnerabilities is a global function that gains almost all of its value when it's singular. That being said, there are lots and lots of other vulnerability management functions that exist and build on top of it, which again, the EUVD the National Vulnerability Database in the United States is already doing. So for policymakers, right, we must disaggregate these two different functions, the singular global catalog where a vulnerability is assigned a unique identifier and then is accessible for people to go look that up. And the things that you might build on top of that, such as maybe a known exploited vulnerabilities catalog that has requirements associated with it, right? When something is added to the KEV, US government agencies have to patch it within a certain amount of time. That is a national function. So the policy framework that we lay out in the paper is essentially, we need to have a global vulnerability catalog that is the successor of the CVE program. And it's the successor in the sense of the architecture has challenges, needs to be modernized, etc. But the core goodness that Pete and other volunteers like him have built out over the next quarter century must be maintained, but we need a better governance structure. That's part of it. And part of it is we then need countries or regions to have national vulnerability management programs that are built atop of that. So that's the first part of the paper in terms of what's the policy framework. And then from our standpoint, what we need to see here to get out of fragmentation, which is the real risk, is we need US leadership, something that Josh highlighted. But that US leadership can't be just, we're going to run it in our own way, because then you will see actual fragmentation, which is what the global CVE, the GCVE program is. You can get a GCVE ID. This is another relatively new thing set up by Luxembourg without a CVE ID. That is what fragmentation looks like. The EUVD, European Union policymakers said, this is a global good. We're going to tie our program and build it on top of it. That's good. But we are at dangerously close to seeing fragmentation and going back in time, which we want to avoid. US policymakers need to lead in order to get us out of this mess. But to do so, that also means we're going to need a more inclusive governance structure at the end of the day, one that represents both the people who know how this program runs and have built it, and also other governments that today recognize that their cybersecurity is critically dependent on this program as well.
I endorse a lot of what Nick just said. Some fine points. What is CVE? At the end of the day, CVE is just a namespace. If you boil it down, it's an identifier that commonly identifies all vulnerabilities. Some people want to add weaknesses in there. No, that's an SDLC problem. Others want to put configurations in there because they'll help critical infrastructures. I think that's a different problem. Others want to add malware. That's a different problem. So when you look at things like EUVD and they add that, that's good. It's regional. It also has to do with how they do things in the EU. KEV is a method that's done in the United States for North America and for critical infrastructures. We want to support each of those. Why? Because they help the customers in those regions. When I say customers, I'm talking about organizations. And that's important because we're trying to address the problem. But let's go back to what is a CVE? We have two different definitions in CVE.org, which is correct. Yes, I am battling with that. But we need to have a better finite what it is. There's 473 CNAs as of today and 3 CNA LRs. That's a CNA of last resort. 2 are government and MITRE, and 1 is Red Hat. Why don't we have more? Because that's real federation. We have a stifling of trying to have control here. I like government participation. They should give us the requirements. We should answer their regional problem sets. But the bits and bytes do not have a flag on them. They travel across the entire internet. And those of us who produce things, I used to be on the producer side, so I still think that way. But the producers can quickly put this together. The JSON 5 was built for anyone who knows how CVE works. But JSON 5.2 is getting ready to come out. That is built by a bunch of volunteers with code donated. It should be open and transparent for everyone, not a secret sauce, because everyone depends on this. So let's figure out what we really need and build it. But we can't make it be the database for every malware configuration, another problem. But guess what? Technologically, we can aggregate databases to give you that answer. But what is your requirement? Because we're not talking. And to follow what Megan said before, following a little movie quote, what we have here is a failure to communicate.
So, I will also say I appreciated getting the opportunity to read the paper, and a lot of great insights, and I liked how the model it built. I also think, though, there's a risk in transitioning to a global vulnerability database now. I think there's a lot of I think we have to right the ship and kind of plug the holes and kind of ensure we're building the right thing prior to, and maybe the solution as I see it, and this might be sound like color of the socks kind of conversation, but I think going with blue today. But long story short, I do think there's an issue of we really need to get this right before we consider handing it off to an internet like a global entity or new funding sources. And I think that means really focusing on, I'll give CISA some credit for what they put out. They did identify many of the right issues, and trying to focus on like, how do we build better quality within the system? How do we set this up for long-term success? And I think some of that's going to look like governance and building with international partners and getting in the right place. And then I think is the time for a discussion about whether that is governed by some broader international entity. But I think, in the near term, we have to essentially, figure out the long-term funding mechanisms that will stabilize the process and recognize some of the modernization that has to happen. I think we all probably have different viewpoints on what that modernization looks like, but that's why we have to have those conversations in a stable instance before kind of trying to rethink everything, in my opinion.
You to the point you wanted.
Yeah, I see where you're headed, Mitch. I can't say I agree with everything on that, but the challenge here is, and I've heard along with some of my cohorts from multiple governments, okay, almost two handfuls, and a regional concern, and they're looking to be at the table now because their requirements are quite honestly now, or they're balkanized, and to me that balkanization is bad for everyone. As I was saying to someone before during the break, it takes a vendor over 2 years to go ahead and pipeline that automation out. And then if you look at, Wiz and your compatriots, it takes another year or so. The consumer is waiting 4 years to figure out how to do that. So I don't think we have that luxury of time. And if they had that requirement now, why don't we build it now?
Yeah, and I don't think I disagree with that. I think that can be started through memorandums of agreement between different nations and sitting down for bilateral communication for alignment on these things, and then with a long-term plan for kind of how to do.
Governments don't produce. So you're missing the crowd that does the work, yeah, and has to do the response and produces the information. I watched, we had a grading of all the CNA, and then we have this list that comes out bi-weekly. I think it's now monthly. Currently the list has 252 CNAs who did it properly out of 473, 476 if you're actually fully correct. Do you know, when I talk with the peace search, I host them on a call every 3 weeks, they don't know what the grading criteria is.
Yeah, I'd like to see that.
That's a problem. That's what we're missing here, is that engagement.
Yeah, I do think there's an opportunity for more transparency and more work in that approach for certain. And I think that's part of the immediate steps, right, that I'm kind of talking about here.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, right, this is coming back to what does U.S. leadership look like? And some of that is absolutely stop the bleeding, which, to be fair, right, is something that we've heard public commitments from CISA that they're going to continue to support the program. And, that's good, right? That is absolutely critical. But part of the leadership is saying, I think, Mitch, as you're alluding to, that like we want input from other responsible actors in cyberspace at the governmental level, even though, in our paper, one of the pitfalls that we highlight, right, that is certainly omnipresent when it comes to governments talking with each other is they're going to leave the private sector out. They're going to close the door and they're going to have a conversation without the people who built the program that we all rely on and who use it, the consumers, the folks who are downstream, who are, whether they're vendors, tool vendors sitting in the room that use it to help amplify and make their customers safer, or the actual frontline cybersecurity defenders who the program was created for in the first place. So that is a huge risk. On the other hand, I do completely agree with Pete that if there isn't strong leadership now that is cognizant of the fact that maintaining this as in the current governance structure is very likely to be unsustainable and will just cause us to take a giant step back and return to a world we don't want to live in, where we don't know what the heck we're talking about with a particular vulnerability. US leadership is also required to say, we recognize this and we are going to go out and bring an open tent to have more conversations about the future of this program.
So we've been tiptoeing around this idea and it's been brought up. Let's just get into it. We talked about during the prep call yesterday, governance. And during the prep call, basically it's fraud. It's the governance of the CVE program is problematic, to put it mildly. So let's just kind of dive into it. Like, let's talk about what the challenges are with it and where you think this is going and how should this program be governed so that it is sustainable and that it's something that we don't have to worry about getting an email at the 11th hour saying that it's going to be defunded.
I hate going first on this one, but look, I think funding is the first thing that needs to be solved for, and I think this is the perfect example of something that needs no year funding when it comes to the federal government. Just to start with, when we're talking the near term, right? This should not be something that when there's a government shutdown or some sort of concern that we have to wonder how many more weeks before this goes. Again, this is a highly operational action, and it needs to be treated that way. Just like Social Security checks should still go out, et cetera, et cetera. There's certain functions of government that must continue, um, and we can't worry about like how we're contracting this in the next, 6 months. In addition to that, that means more transparency and more accountability. I think there's some parallels, not completely, but some parallels to like what was happening with FedRAMP a bit prior, where there was a lack of visibility into how it was being managed. There was some concerns at the White House level and beyond about the program. They might not like entirely where it ended up, and some people do, some people don't, and where they're going. But you have to admit that they've taken the 20X program and they've moved fast to try and show visibility into where they want to go, bring in outside input, and drive towards results. I think there's opportunities here to do something like that that includes international and industry and everyone else. Once we get, as we solve for that funding problem as well, and kind of show that good faith in building something that works, both, whether it's with the US government, whether with the private sector and internationally, bring those folks together. I do think there's a reality, and I think I'm not disagreeing, I think I'm agreeing with you on this, that there are these different databases and needs that are going to be out there, and that's going to become more and more, and I'm sure we'll get to this. Cloud is a very different issue around security, and vulnerabilities is one small piece of that equation. Misconfigurations, there's a lot of different issues that are at play. AI is very similar. IoT, there's unique aspects to all of these that require a different kind of lens, let's say, on the problem. And I think that is going to require, whether we like it or not, some changes to how we do the CVE program, or at least some alignment questions. So those kind of governance mechanisms for that kind of quality era, to put it in CISO words, have to happen as well. So there's a lot of steps to take, but I think immediate is working on funding and kind of a a model for change and reevaluation of how we bring that is wide and broad.
Funding is a great big problem. March 6, 2026. That's the date the contract runs out. We are right on the cusp that we could actually transfer everything right now to another organization, whether it's the foundation or somewhere else, and make that date. That's how close we are. We wait 2 months, the window closes. If you talk to our international partners, they will tell you right away, we don't trust the Americans. Look what we did to NVD. Look what we did to the April volcano event. Now they're asking questions about shutdowns. There's no permanency or air of permanency. And so those governments, about a handful, are willing to chip in, but they're afraid of the pressure that CISA won't allow that in. There are private sector who want to do the same. I know that I'm the treasurer, having those discussions. So how do we get past that? Because that's the first part, opening the door. When people feel that will work, now they're going to contribute. We need to make that tent open and do so quickly. I agree with you about the cloud. So many things in the cloud are dependent upon other software, and we don't report that. We, the industry producers, don't report that quick enough or at all, because it doesn't require user interaction. We've had great conversations on the CVE board about that, and we haven't come to a good conclusion. AI, we're working, but there's 3 parts of AI. How do you assign something to AI, but not to the LLM? How do you go ahead and use AI for when you eat 373 CVEs in a day from one external source? And more importantly, how do you use AI to find a vulnerability and know it's really a vulnerability? That's a question that all the PSERTs, incident response teams, are looking at. And if you look at incident response or PSERT, it really has 3 functions: responding to the incident, vuln management within the organization and externally, and then finally, it has coordinated vuln disclosure. And you have to realize, while these aren't all the same subject, but they interact and they have a dependency and they push on each other. You know, contrary to the CISA Act going away, there's still been a lot of coordination between private sector. And if you think that doesn't happen, I think you need to understand that that happens all the time, because we know it's incumbent upon us to deliver. I briefed the FS-ISAC one time from the IT-ISAC. Their assumption was, we do this. And when we said, well, we're starting to, they go, you mean you haven't already? That was over a decade ago. So we got to get moving.
So when I look at the governance challenges of the CVE program, they start from the fact that we call it a program, or we act like it is a distinct entity, and it is not, right? It is part of the MITRE Corporation, which is a nonprofit U.S. corporation that operates an FFRDC, a federally funded research and development center, which is where the funding comes in from currently CISA, but a whole host of folks over the years, to run part of it. So part of the CVE program is run using U.S. government dollars, significant majority of it. Part of it is internal to MITRE, and then there's the CVE board, which is made up of, roughly 24 volunteers, some of whom have been there since the very beginning in 1999 and have literally put in thousands of hours to help this program. But it is not a board in any traditional sense that folks who are used to thinking about governance understand. It is an advisory board. It was created by MITRE. It has no independent legal standing. So functionally, while it has, as a matter of fact, provided huge growth and provided lots of value to the program and helped it grow, it doesn't have any independent legal standing on which to provide that. And again, I think it speaks to the value that the program provides day to day, that people have not been looking and saying, this is a very odd governance model, including policymakers, and saying, hey, we're spending money on this. How exactly is it getting spent for a long time? Because it was working well enough and it was critical enough. But at some point, the function that's provided by the CVE program has become so critical that now it's like, oh, well, if it goes away, lots of other things start to fall down. And now that people are starting to look at how it's been built, there are real questions about like, this is probably not normal standard governance practices. And that needs to be fixed. And that is critical from, from my standpoint, right? When we were looking at how do you get out of this, it is you need to start with the governance because, as Pete said, as folks have built things on top of CVE, including governments who are, from my standpoint, the biggest risk, right? The biggest risk of fragmentation is governments say, you have to report things to our database. And instead of, in the wisdom of the EUVD saying, and if it falls within CVE's scope, you need to get a CVE ID for it, they say, and we don't care about it. We have no interest in it. You need to go through the whole process for our specific country or regional database. That's where things start to break. That's why it's so important that governments get buy-in early on from a governance standpoint. But if you do not fix the governance problem, right, I think there are going to be significant challenges with the program. And I completely agree with Pete that there is a proximate cause for policymaker interest, which is the funding question. And if you cannot deal with that at the very base level of your, hierarchy of needs, policymakers must deal with that. But that is not necessarily the long pole in the tent. It's just the most proximate thing. And don't make the mistake that I did as a policymaker, which is to say, oh, the most proximate thing seems to have gone away, so we can let our attention wander. And the real challenge here is the governance issue. So that's why, we talk about the need to transition to a global vulnerability catalog is because we need a new governance structure, one that is inclusive and has empowered leadership not to use the 10,000 meter screwdriver and have governments say to industry, this is the way you should run this program, because they will almost certainly be wrong, but to ensure that there is transparency, accountability, and that the requirements that they have for their national and regional vulnerability management programs to protect their own citizens, cybersecurity across economic security, national security, that there is a way for those requirements to be pushed down to the folks who really know what they're talking about.
So I want to agree with Nick about the policy. I'll re-say it, about the governance of the board. Technically, it is an advisory board. Now, as a board member, I rail against that because that was not what I was sold. That was not what we practiced. And until the funding part, we had a lot of say in a lot of things, except for contracts. Now, I get contract negotiations are private. Great. Okay. We tried the FOIA that. That didn't work. But the issue is the direction, the strategic direction. And when we took that to some of the system leadership over the program, it was, well, we can't talk to the whole board like that. Wait a minute. What are we here for? So I think this is a reset we have an opportunity to do. And it's not that we as a board want to kick us out. That's not the message. If you take that as a message, you missed it. The message is we want to contribute. We want to grow it. We want to serve everyone. And quite honestly, what is the real data that goes with the namespace? Because if we're not providing that and we're not being thorough enough from the people who know what it is, then you run into a different challenge.
I have one or two more questions on my list, but then I do want to open it up to the crowd for questions. So think of your questions that you might want to ask. So I think we've covered a little bit of this, but in your minds, what are the short and midterm risks ahead for the CVE program?
Strategic direction and funding. Notice I didn't put it funding first. It's that strategic direction of what are we answering? Because if you don't do that, the funding doesn't mean a lot. You have to know who's going to sign up, how much for, and what you're trying to accomplish. So I think we need to really set what our strategic direction is And we have to realize it's going to be a multi-year plan. That plan is not going to be, well, we're going to fix some format or we're just going to do some infrastructure and tune it. That's very short-sighted. So we need a much greater set of inputs to answer that question.
So I think in the nearest term, I agree on both fronts. I do think because this has come up organically, it is sat kind of in FFRDC as well as kind of with funding from government. And, you know, as this funding has, I know the NVD is a separate entity, but I think it's hard to talk about this process without having recognized like the role that they've been playing and that now they're talking about enriching CVs separately. I think a rethink of the US government's immediate term approach to this, and you can call it governance, whatever, they really have to decide what direction they want this to take. And I think it really ultimately is going to take US Congress having some attention and CISA putting forward more detail on what they would propose, and frankly, NIST weighing in and getting behind that as well. So I do think that is the near term must do. Having a transparent process, as you said, key. And then, bringing on our key international allies who are also working on this, like the EU. And frankly, some we have been working less so with, like Japan and others, who I think could add a lot because they have their own mature regional structures.
So short-term fragmentation, that's it, right? Like the proximate cause of fragmentation could be funding challenges. But if GCVE takes off, if you end up starting to have people referring canonically to vulnerabilities in multiple ways, that is hard to get the genie back in the bottle. And it took a lot of work from some very smart people, many of them in the US and involved with the CVE program, to help get the EU, when they were standing up the EU PD, to understand that keying to CVEs was in everyone's interest, including EU citizens. If we see fragmentation, it is going to be hard to go back. And that is the short-term risk that keeps me up at night. The medium-term risk is we see governance changes. We see funding stability. Things are headed in the right direction. But back to my 10,000 meter screwdriver, right? Governments stand in too much and they start saying, no. We want other things to be built into the catalog that are not narrowly focused on vulnerabilities, but are just nice to haves. Or they start saying, this is the way that you, industry, who consume the vast majority of these things, right, should be doing things. And that causes people to fragment for still fragmentation. That's the thing that keeps me up at night. But it's fragmentation for a different reason, which is instead of people feeling like the current program is not inclusive and government's going off and doing their own thing, industry stops finding value and says, oh, instead of using CVEs because they're providing something that actually helps us defend ourselves, you start seeing them say, well, I understand that someone regulatorily told me I had to file something, but this is no longer actually improving our cybersecurity. So in the short term, getting governments involved is critical. In the medium term, making sure that that involvement is only at the highest level of saying it's critical cybersecurity infrastructure, it's a common global public good. So those are the kinds of things that governments should be funding. But after that, let the people who are actually operationalizing these vulnerabilities day to day run the system and not say, oh, no, we're going to substitute our judgment for the actual operators who know how built the program and know how to use it day to day.
All right. So I'd like to open up to some questions from the audience. I have many other questions on my list too. I can keep going, but I wanted to give you all an opportunity.
So you guys have talked a little bit about funding being a challenge that you want to solve. Can you talk a little bit more about what you think that solution is? I heard know your funding, which to me sounds more like you're wanting to address the potential for fiscal cliffs. But what is the structure of the funding solution look like?
Diversity. That's the most important thing, right? Like if we are looking at this through an appropriations lens, or like how does the US government fund it on more stable footing so we don't run into contract cliffs, we have missed the point. The point is you need a diversity of funding. This is a global good. And that is very, like we have seen, I've heard echoes of this administration talking about, hey, the US government has been subsidizing global security. This is a core example of the US government has been subsidizing global security. And that is not to say that the US government doesn't need to continue to play a leadership role, but we need a diversity of funding. Other folks need to step up and bring money to the table. That can include industry, as long as there are clear conflict of interest, as long as there's a diversity of funding, as long as people are not buying board seats, are not staying on for a long term. But at its core, this is a common good, right? The free rider problem, this is textbook economics, and the kind of thing that governments or philanthropies are well placed to provide baseline funding. But diversity is much more critical than looking within any particular funding stream and saying, well, how much, how exactly should we fine tune the conflict of interest policy, or how exactly should we look for an endowment? It's like diversify, diversify, diversify. 26 years of the US government single-handedly subsidizing global cybersecurity in this program is enough.
We've looked at this from the CVE Foundation perspective, and we want to balance out where our funding comes from. So for instance, ideally, governments have 30%, no more. In fact, we want no group to have more than 40%. They don't get a choice to say, I veto. No, once the money's in, it goes into the pot unless you give me a restricted to build something. Not going to do that. I've been the treasurer for FIRST, the IT Sector Coordinating Council, and a few other orgs. So this is a problem that we've got to say, your money doesn't give you the right of refusal to change and stop something, and it doesn't swivel the entire organization. It's an input maybe, but it has to be prioritized. And if it makes the cut line, that's great. If it doesn't, maybe we're short of funds. I don't know what the answer is, because it comes down to, or it's not a high enough priority for everyone. We can't say, listen, we're gonna add malware to this and make it a malware database. That's a separate thing. Glad to work on it, but it probably doesn't belong with vulnerabilities. So we just have to figure out what that means. If later on we want to go to something bigger, that's great. But I want to leave you with a thought. The vulnerability ecosystem did not have a grand architect. It was more like a couple of wet paintbrushes and you splattered the window. Great dots. How does anything flow? Who built that flow? I challenged that to the guys who do it, and everyone kind of looked at me like, and realized now we're trying to architect that. So this isn't just about CVE, the namespace. It's about how do we effectively communicate and fix a problem. And not all problems that are identified as a vulnerability need to be fixed, because it's just impossible for software to be done that way. So we have to think through what is risk.
So I'm going to take a slightly different approach on this one. So just one, I will say, like, I agree, more diversity of funding is a good thing. I will say, though, I think if someone gives 40% of the funding and threatens to walk away, they tend to get what they want. I will
40% of an aggregate. So that's 40% from all governments.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think if there's substantial payers in, like, they tend to get what they want. I will say, and they're going to want board seats and things like that. I think there's risk in the current model, obviously. I think there's also risk in new models. And I think we need to be really thoughtful and iterative in getting to the right place on this. So this is why I kind of think, yes, more money is a good thing. In the past, like, the US government has found ways to do that. You look at State Department's models for bringing in private sector funding, international funding for initiatives. I think that's a good way to start down this path of finding additional funds. I think moving dramatically to a new governance model before we identify where we're going it presents as much peril perhaps as just trying to find the right ways to be iterative about this. So my caution and kind of idea around funding is that we should first identify, and I do think it is a global leadership issue. I'll agree with that. And like we have some agita recently in this nation about what that looks like. But I do think, this has also allowed us to be a leader in the cybersecurity industry writ large. It's one of the many building blocks that's allowed America to lead in this area. And I think that has been an economic good and a general good as someone, it's like we also created the internet in many ways, things like that. But I think we should be really cautious about the diversification and the model around it as we build there.
Other questions in the audience?
Oh, that's okay. I can fill space for a second. We're 4 years behind on some of our development activities for our requirements in the current model. And it's not the board problem. Okay. There was another question about the EU. Believe it or not, the EU has announced they want to work towards ENISA towards becoming a root. They're in the process of doing that. They eventually want to become a top level root. So realize that the EU is trying to engage more with the CVE program and enlarge the number of CNA, CVE naming authorities by country. So they're actually investing in this, and that's why they have a keen interest to be here now.
So Peter, for the CVE program, you said the contract is up in March 2026 and that it could continue to operate for some time just with it being open source. What would that look like?
Well, the signed contract is good through March 6th. That's a date that was between CISA and their contractor, in this case, MITRE. Could the program work beyond that? Yes. Functionally, yes. Could it be assumed? Since the code is open source, it was one of my developers helped put a lot of that together. By the way, after we submitted and tested and all that, we broke it in 12 hours, had to fix it. But there is a capability there where anyone, even back in April, could continue to receive a CVE. We no longer do blocks of CVEs, by the way. You can actually ask for by CVE. So there's a capability there that is resident in the current infrastructure unless they turn the electric off. And depending upon where we are, let's say in February, could we reconstitute the entire thing? Yes. People are taking snapshots of the data all the time.
Thank you.
Got time for one more? Anything else? Everybody wants lunch? All right, so let's thank you all. Thank you for my panel. I want to thank my panelists for their participation. We'll take a break for lunch and come back in an hour.